Moving on to our next speaker. He's the current CEO of World Vision and has served as the CEO of NSE listed IDFC. He has done his mechanical engineering from VJTI and MMS Finance from SPJIMS. He has more than 24 years of experience in banking and finance with ICICI, SCICI, and Citibank. He served as group head of IDC Foundation at IDFC Limited until July 2015.
For those who don't know, World Vision India is a Christian humanitarian organization spread across 174 districts in India. It works through long term sustainable community development and immediate disaster relief assistance. All its work is focused on building the capacity and ability of communities and families to ensure the well being of their children. It has responded to every major disaster in India, including the tsunami, Kashmir earthquake, and flood situations in several states. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Cherian Thomas.
So you have these social interventions required for different categories of people and the financial interventions accompanying these social interventions. Okay, that's how one looks at sustainability from that point of view. So you have, for instance, for this group of people, clearly a need to be empowered, to know their own rights sometimes. For instance, children who are educated, uh, in schools, we've found through some of the recent surveys of children that while enrollment has improved significantly, there is very poor learning outcomes. Children of reading a class who are studying in class 5 barely able to read a class 2 textbook, unable to solve sums which class 2 students should solve. Children in 8th standard not being able to do similarly a class 5 arithmetic problem, or not unable to read a class 5 textbook. So remedial education interventions, inadequate training, the need to create physical assets, gender issues, need for child protection, substance abuse, and also the no access to a whole host of civic services and housing itself. And the financial intervention to deal with this group of people, and often in dealing with this group of people, trying to move them to the next level, is often in kind support, grants, social security, physical assets, nutrition, water sanitation. Now, nutrition is very critical because increasingly we are talking about the critical 1000-day window in which nutritional interventions are very critical. It starts with the time a child is conceived in the mother's womb, 9 months it spends in the mother's womb, the 2 years thereafter, a period of 1000 days in which the whole nutritional support is critical. How is this done? Who pays for it? Is it always government? This is where this has to be clearly thought through. For those who are in this bracket, by and large, all these social interventions, sometimes to a limited extent, with some limited in-kind support, low payment link solutions, sometimes grants, particularly for training and capacity building, and microfinance and banking to finance the activities that they do are critical. Uh, for the others, of course, the access is there by and large, but sometimes issues like gender and child abuse, substance abuse still need interventions. To a large extent, they can pay for it. Some capacity building support is needed, but by and large, access to commercial finance is possible. So the bulk of social ventures would really be operating in the first two areas that we talked about, where we are moving people from abject poverty to a sustainable living, which is what I call a type A path. And in the next step, in moving people from sustainably living themselves to a thriving environment where they move into sometimes often developing enterprises, employing other people. So where they are really scaling up their own economic ability. And in this, we have across the whole range of social ventures, you have grassroots level implementers who are involved in training, capacity building, and in empowerment. Sometimes these are theme focused, where you work on areas like gender, on children, on issues like disability, on education, healthcare, resilience, climate change, clean city that we talked about, on livelihoods, different issues can be there at the grassroots level. Uh, there are many among the social ventures, many like us, for instance, who also have the ability to raise funds and sometimes depend on grassroots level implementers to implement it, or themselves have a limited capacity or are able to implement in full. So the availability and the ability to be financially sustainable often influences the kind of role that social investors play. There are also a whole host of social ventures which develop low-cost products, whether it is in interventions like water and sanitation. Water purifiers, very low-cost water purifiers in villages where sometimes the arsenic content is high, or any other metallic content is high. Uh, there are different solutions, and often many homegrown good solutions which come up. Bio toilets, for instance, a low-cost bio toilet solution for people in in slum clusters, but done and operated on commercial or close to commercial terms. Food products, nutrition, medicines, housing, different examples of entities which focus on this area of operation. Okay. And of course, you have low cost services. Sometimes these are because of regulation, the whole telecom sector, because of regulation, has become accessible to people who are in the lowest strata. If you recall the cost of mobile telephones when they were introduced in the various circles, for instance, in the 4 metros, it used to cost 16 rupees 80 paise per minute. It dropped, and that was both for outgoing and incoming calls. Okay, and that was sometime in 93, 94. In a little over 20 years, we've seen how this rapid, dramatic change in affordability as far as low cost services have happened. Or an organization like Red Bus on its own has connected transport and made transport solutions possible for a very average person. And it focused on bus transport, which is the bulk of transport for people in India. And it has actually made that convenient, easy for everybody. Of course, it benefits everyone in that segment, but it also helps the poor. And of course, you have specialized agencies which provide microfinance, funding to small and medium enterprises, and banks as well who operate in this space. So what gives sustainability? Sustainability is all about making sure that as an enterprise, you have access to funds which allow your activity. So if you are an entity which is involved in dealing with type A work, which is moving people from abject poverty to a sustainable level, it would mean that the bulk of the audience would not have the capacity to pay for what is being provided, which would mean again that the bulk of the funding would necessarily need to be in the form of grants. And therefore your funding model should be able to allow you to give grants, to give gifts, to give in-kind support over a period of time, getting nothing in return from the beneficiaries. So one of the well-developed models which which many large organizations use is what is called as a sponsorship model. So whether it is sponsorship of children, and World Vision is kind of fine-tuned it. It's one of the largest sponsors of children worldwide, where you raise money to support children and look at that model as a funding model for development of the child and of the child in his or her community. So it goes both towards direct benefits that the child enjoys as well as the community. And this is a very, very sustainable model in the sense that World Vision itself has used it for more than 50 years. Save the Children uses it. Equally, it has been done for aged people. It is being done for people with disabilities. And it taps retail giving. It taps really the retail market. There are new products being talked about. For instance, issuance of social warrants, issuance of social bonds, which are probably low cost or very deeply discounted at very, very low cost, which are possible methods by which many of these entities can actually raise funding from the market. Grants, many of these organizations use grants from the government. Actually, one would see that after 2004, the percentage of direct funding into healthcare and education as a percentage of the total expenses have seen a very significant increase from, I think, something like 0.5% to about 1.6, 1.7, 1.8%. So a lot more of government funding now is available for a lot of the activity that I talked about, both which will help people who are in abject poverty or just about barely being able to make a sustainable life for themselves. So it is about using these grants creatively from the government, from bilateral, multilateral agencies, from foundations. A very important source of funding that has recently, thanks to the enactment of the Companies Act in 2013, is the CSR funding. And this opens a new route altogether for funding. It's not that CSR funding was not taking place, but while earlier it was voluntary, it's now become mandatory. And under the CSR rules, areas in which companies can actually provide and use 2% of its pre-tax profits are very, very clearly defined. The estimates about how much of this quantum is that it could be as high as 20,000 crores. But we have again found over experience that it is much easier in humanitarian situations. We talked about how World Vision responds to most relief needs in the country. We just responded very actively to the relief work in Chennai. In fact, even as we are talking today, we are doing the last of the rehabilitation and early recovery distribution with funding from Tetra Pak. And we have seen in this, particularly in the Chennai floods, a very, very voluntary and a very quick response from the corporate sector. It really surprised us, the scale and the quantum of which the giving was. But I believe that this could be, if well used, a very important source of funding for very targeted outcomes that we look at. Then, of course, you have models which are linked to certain revenue that your activity can generate. It starts, of course, with funding from certain angel investors who are socially minded, translate into loans. There could be some mezzanine funding. There could be social return funding, that is investors who look at only an 8 to 12% return on the investment that they put in. Later on, private equity, public markets, and this whole range. Particularly in the financing sector, you've seen in microfinance how larger microfinance companies have now converted themselves to banks. Bandhan, for instance, has become a bank, which would mean that it would have access to public deposits, a whole array of retail funding. In the set of 10 payment banks that were announced, there were a few microfinance companies who made the transition to being payment banks, which means that it allows them for a certain kind of funding which banks normally access from the retail market to also be available to them. So this is clearly the combination of funding that is often available for people to be able to engage creatively across this whole spectrum of activities, and allows them to choose what it is that they want to do in terms of their own positioning, in terms of being social organizations. And in this, there are certain choices that one makes, and that again influences financial sustainability. Do we do it alone, or do we outsource some of it? Do we work alone, or do we work with networks and through networks and alliances, which is a little more difficult? Do we focus on outcomes, so it's more targeted and focused? And that's a very ever-present debate and currently very active debate, even within my own entity, is focusing on outcomes in a much more focused manner in one or two sectors, rather than look at multi-sectoral intervention, slower transformation. So these choices are what one makes even when one looks at this whole issue of financial sustainability. So I thought I'd just talk very briefly at a very basic level to begin with, and leave it to you to ask questions or come by with comments of your own, so that we can have a profitable discussion. Thank you.
Questions, anyone?
Just from what you said that a large part of your funding comes from the sponsorship thing.
Yes.
What part comes from India and what parts from outside India?
Yeah, actually 80% of our funding comes from global sources, because we are a global organization. So the way we are divided is we have support offices and we have field offices. Support offices raise funding. They are in the more developed parts of the world. Field offices use the money. India is a hybrid. We use both.
Just one question.
Yeah.
What is your experience about the cost of raising the funds? Suppose you raise $100, whatever that is. How much do you have to spend in terms of setting the organization which raises the funds?
See, within India, when we look at the money given to us, of the funding that is raised by us, we spend about 6% on fundraising costs.
In the retail, from the retail market or from the
From
institutional
the
market?
overall market. It's our average cost.
Mhm.
This will increase further as we go more and more retail.
Okay.
Okay.
And
And then we have, and then about the roughly the same amount, 6% is also the admin cost, the overhead cost, the non-program related.
And then international funding will do most of the retail sort of raising of the funding.
Beg your pardon?
International market, what is the cost of funding? Cost of fundraising? It is mostly retail forms.
See, they again have a combination of retail and high net worth individuals. So the average cost is always tried to be kept around the 10%, 15% range everywhere globally.
Hello. Yeah. India is a very young country, as a large percentage of our population is between 15 to 25 years of age, and this percentage is much more than what is available for the developed countries. So, cashing in on that, our group Think People decided to do a social venture on the youth of our country, and to engage the talent available within this pool, and to develop to help in nation building. We call this Choti Si Asha, and this is a value driven solution that we intend giving. This is to utilize the time of children and youth in problem solving and in solving the local problems. So for this, the kind of social venture that we aspire is to create a link and use technology to create this link which bring this children and youth onto a common platform, and use the talent that they bring for solving problems that they are capable of solving. So this is a bridge between the youth and the problems that exist in this country.